Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around after lunch. I'm Sarah Jackson. I'm an assistant professor in the Communication Studies department here at Northeastern with an affiliation with the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. And we're going to do something a little bit different now than what we've been doing so far. Different in two ways. One, what you're about to experience is going to be less formal. No one's presenting research or papers. We're hoping this will be sort of more of a conversation in which you should feel free to include yourselves. And we have an awesome panel here of awesome students. So part of sort of the framework for this panel is that as the planners of this convening discussed what we wanted to include today, we thought that it was really important to include the voices of young queer and feminist students and activists. So I'm sure no one will be shocked or stunned to know that sometimes there are generational disagreements and divides among feminists and among folks with queer politics and among activists and all these things. And so we thought it would be really great to sort of include and validate the experiences of current students, right? Whose experiences and sort of thoughts around some of the issues that we're here to talk about today may or may not be similar to what other folks are going to be talking about. So with that said, I am going to just give a brief introduction of each of these students. I will admit that several of them are like my favorites. I know I'm not supposed to have favorite students, but it's true. So go easy on them. They can take it, they're tough. All right, so just here to my left is Sonia Banishchik, and she is a fifth year undergraduate student at Northeastern University. I'm sorry, I already messed up. They prefer the pronouns they and them, and are a fifth year undergraduate student at Northeastern University pursuing a combined major in communication and sociology. Sonia is also one of the founding members of a new organization here on campus called the Queer Student Union. Right next to her, right next to them is Daniela. Daniela also prefers the pronouns they and them. They are a senior studying cultural anthropology, sociology, and international affairs, and are also one of the founding members of the Queer Student Union. Next to Daniela is Kate Frischer. Kate is a senior at Northeastern University. She prefers the pronouns she and her. She studies international affairs with minors in political science and communication, and she's been very involved in an organization here at Northeastern called SHARE, the Sexual Health Advocacy and Resource Education organization that also has sort of a sub-organization called SARC, which deals with sexual assault and response on campus. And then, last but not least, at the very end, is Sydney Mokel. She prefers the pronouns she and her. She's a first year in international affairs student. So like very impressive, this is her first year. And she is part of the Progressive Student Alliance and also the newly founded Queer Student Union. So I'm going to start with sort of some framing or leading questions for these folks. And then I'm actually I have great faith that we'll be able to sort of just have a conversation here and as needed, interject questions or thoughts as they arise. So basically what I wanted to start with kind of comes out of that framework I gave you for why we thought having this panel was important, which is that we wanted to hear what issues are most important right now to queer and feminist students and student activists on college campuses. So we know that these issues change, evolve, etc. So I wanted to just open this up to everyone here and have each person speak to what they think in terms of sort of the themes of this conference and the themes we're seeking to address here more generally are the most important issues in terms of their experience as students.
Thank you. So I had actually prepared some thoughts, some critiques about sort of like mainstream feminism or such a response to the whole sex wars debate. But I actually don't have to say any of that because All the speakers so far today have been really amazing in terms of presenting work and theorizing in ways that I feel like are really complex and do address a lot of the issues that I had had with sort of like traditional or what we understand as to be mainstream feminism, such as like critiques of carceral feminism and centering the voices and the experiences of trans women of color who face like sexual violence and violence in our community. So I guess for me, an important issue is addressing queer and trans exclusion on college campuses, which I think is a really important thing to address at Northeastern. There's just a lot of silence. There's not a lot of conversation happening, and I find that even within like gender specific or gender and sexuality specific spaces on campus, those are lacking. Not to mention kind of like the broader community. So that's definitely something that I'm going to want to touch on today.
So me personally, something that I think is important that is needed to be addressed on college campuses is something that is reflected in my personal relationship with feminism and with being queer, which is something that I have claimed as an identity when I came to college, which is a privilege in and of itself. It's kind of this like bittersweet relationship that I have with feminism within academia, wherein for me, coming into college created a space for me to understand what feminism was, to experience validation for my experiences, to experience a space to kind of reclaim my body and understand how my experiences and how my interpretation and my perspective of the world is influenced by bigger systems. So academia has been incredibly important for me in that sense. On the contrary, like it's clashed. It's made me also feel very alienated and isolated in how I'm able to communicate with people about my experiences, about what feminism is, about being queer, about being genderqueer, about participating and being compliant in violent systems. It feels I experience a disconnect in feminist classes and feminist spaces on campus. So that's something that I'm kind of bringing to the table today, is this walls that are created around academic spaces that, while they're very important and validating and have allowed me to pursue my own self-actualization and my understanding of my identity, have also made me feel more alienated. For instance, at least in my relationship with my mother, like I can't communicate my full self as I have gained language to do so in academia. I have felt more isolated from my mother. So how to negotiate that?
So I think that what Daniela and Sonia brought up are both really important points. I kind of interpreted and understood this question in a slightly different way. So I'll apologize because it's also very Northeastern specific. And as Dr. Jackson mentioned, a lot of my activism on campus has centered around sexual health advocacy and education. And then on the other side, also related, our school's sexual assault response policies and systems that are currently in place. So in terms of the question and sort of the themes of this conference, pleasure and danger, the challenges that I really see, and again, these are Northeastern specific, it's very much just my experience on this campus, but so within sexual health advocacy on campus, it's a very fine line to walk because on the one hand, I feel like Northeastern very much overemphasizes the danger, which is legitimate. There are things to be worried about, like STIs, HIV, AIDS. There are concerns when it comes to sexual health. But what I found and what our group, the Sexual Health Advocacy Resource Education student group has found is how do we bring that into also incorporating pleasure, also incorporating positive sexuality. So it's not just this terrifying thing that you have to always be scared of. And a big part of that too is healthy relationships. So that's one of the issues. And then on the other side, activism surrounding consent and rape culture and the sexual assault response policies on campus. It's sort of the reverse, where, especially at Northeastern, I can come out and say our administration has a horrific policy and a horrific response to sexual assault on campus. We're currently under investigation for violating Title IX, and if you talk to any of the students, we all have stories. So I think, we would all say that. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I feel fairly certain that everyone here would say, yeah, we're going to be found in violation, because it's true. But if you look at the messaging that the university is giving out, it's all surrounding the consent is sexy. It's all surrounding pleasure and not actually focusing on the systematic issues that exist. So, and this kind of goes to a broader thing that I hope we can talk about. I know a lot of us have been involved in previous conversations about this, but just the general commodification of us as students, how we are only as valuable to the institution as far as we are promoting their image. So I think that really plays out in these two issues where the schools, when it's, the responsibility is with the student, such as sexual health, it's only focused on danger. But when it's an issue that probably lies in the responsibility with the school, there's no focus on how they're promoting an unsafe environment or what they're doing to make it dangerous.
So once again, it's very stressful to be going last after all of that. So as a first year and someone who doesn't necessarily have the same background or experiences with administration or even activism on campus, despite my really... Oh, okay. Is this better?
Yeah, just pull the mic closer.
Really close.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so as a first year and someone who doesn't have that same sort of background and experience with administration or just campus culture, despite my really fortunate involvement in the creation of QSU, I guess maybe I'll concentrate maybe more on classroom experiences. I have found that so far I've had a positive, or at least maybe more visible than I expected, presence of feminist faculty and professors, such as Professor Horn, who I had last semester. So I am comfortable in that aspect, but I guess one thing I was considering, especially throughout some of the presentations, was the issue of access perhaps beyond that, echoing what Daniela said about academia and how it's sort of isolated. Just, I suppose I'm wondering, looking in the future and considering the classes and the courses I'm going to be taking, how maybe ordinary students, like those, as you might say, like who are outside the choir, like can be more involved in that process, because there's a lot of really wonderful things going on here. So I suppose that's all I have.
Okay, great. Oh, is this on? No?
Yes.
No? Okay. Okay, so next question, and thank you for that, and Kate keeping it real down there. So, and I think actually Sydney's sort of ending there was a really good segue to the next question I wanted to ask these folks, which is how you perceive conversations about issues regarding gender, sexuality, things like pleasure and danger being handled within various networks at universities. And, you are all Northeastern students, and so, I said earlier, like, you're speaking to your experience at Northeastern, but I think we can generalize probably many of these thoughts to experiences students are having on I will say that it's probably somewhat generalizable to other campuses. And so if you guys could talk a little bit about sort of the experiences you have in terms of trying to have conversations about radical sexual politics or radical gender politics in the classroom, with the administration, among your peers, and what you see working and maybe what you see not working and what solutions you might see to some of those things or not. And you don't have to go in order, but you can. Someone has to go.
So I clearly have can everyone hear?
Yeah.
I clearly.
You guys got to really speak up and.
So I clearly have very strong opinions on how the administration deals with these issues. And in a word, I would say terribly. So I think that the biggest issue is that they are not having the conversations. So specifically with regards to sexual assault on Northeastern campus, which every single student knows is a problem, or that might be generalizing a little bit, but every single student who is paying attention knows that it is a problem. And then you look, so our main service provider, and I use air quotes because they're completely inadequate and ineffective. You look at what they're doing, and they've clearly increased their programming. They're doing some effective programming, some not so much. But the school administration, I personally believe, knows that this is a problem. I mean, they're under federal investigation. They can't not know. But they haven't acknowledged that there is a problem. And for me, personally, I think that there's no way that you can move forward and begin to solve these issues on campus without first saying this problem exists. So in terms of solutions, one of the things that SARC, the Sexual Assault Response Campaign, is doing, Northeastern did, following the guidelines of the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault on campus. Last semester, they did release the Campus Climate Survey. It was not publicized. Most people don't know that it happened. It was allegedly random, but most of the people I know who got it are already involved with these issues and very progressive students to begin with. So one of the solutions that we're trying to pursue is asking that they release the results, because that is a very logical first step. And we think that that would be like a really good way to promote transparency and sort of just begin a conversation. I think that that's my biggest issue with Northeastern. There is no conversation. So, I don't know if anyone else.
Going off of that, Kate, I think that one of the biggest frustrations that we come into contact with as student activists is just basically all of the derailing tactics that occur, how often we're slowed down, how long it takes to get a meeting just to be able to have conversations. And then when that does happen, when we finally get folks' attention, there has to be a lot of escalating on our end in order to even get to that stage. And then the solution that's put forth is, hey, let's form a committee, let's talk about it, let's set up a meeting. And that really creates a huge problem in trying to hold the administration accountable. I think that accountability is really key. There isn't really a direct channel to be able to speak with key decision makers who actually have the institutional power to take our concerns and turn them into something that actually has lasting results. And I understand that that is also just a result of the way that everything is structured. I can't expect one person in one department to put forth a policy change or a program that will actually effectively address problems, but that's where the conversation comes in. And that is just not being had. We don't really have the space for that because every single time that we try to have conversations, Northeastern's image protection task force, so to speak, steps in and tries to mitigate the conversation and turn it into something that that basically covers them and removes that accountability. One of the things I really actually appreciated about Wagate's talk earlier was the role of social media and of new media and ways in which activists are using that to turn up the heat a little bit. I think that we found that to be semi-successful and increasingly so as we figure out, how to kind of put little pressure points because those are ways in which that's kind of those are media trails that Northeastern can't really control.
I suppose I was just going to speak to the fact that I do think the importance of new media and ways in which I've seen that here on campus. So Northeastern is really active social media wise in terms of all the accounts it has. As part of my orientation, we had a 1 hour session that was partially about getting involved through social media and all the Twitter accounts that everyone has. But also there was a campaign carried out, not specifically feminist or queer, but the Real State of NU, in contrast to what is known as the State of NU, which is a speech given by our president. So the fact that there was that sort of negotiation and sort of relationship between the two by posting in both tags or hashtags on Twitter. We were able to sort of force a discussion, even if they flooded our tags with more positive stuff about everything great Northeastern is doing. But still, that was we took pictures during the actual event and live tweeted things, and that was really useful and interesting. And it, like Sonia said, it left a sort of trail that they couldn't control.
So I guess I have 2 points. One is kind of like on the institutional level, and one is more so in the classroom setting. In terms of the institutional level, in my experience, Northeastern administration, and I think it's safe to say generally administrations of academic institutions, are very resistant to student organizing and to students implementing change unless it is able to be manipulated in a way that benefits the image of the university. So right now we're running a campaign to have single stall bathrooms changed into gender neutral bathrooms. Why are they gendered to begin with? I literally have no idea. But I see it being a campaign that is not gonna experience a particular amount of resistance because the university will be like, oh, we're so progressive. We are really green even though we're invested in fossil fuels, and we have a lot of gender neutral bathrooms. So I can see that kind of being the narrative, and this is something that is consistent. It's an exhausting process to fight against administration, and then they very quickly will say, erase all of the activism that happened, all of the organizing, erase all of the pushback that they did, and claim ownership over kind of like all of the work of students and kind of co-opt that. It's really exhausting, and I speak from personal experience in that sense. In terms of classroom settings, when people ask me about my experience at Northeastern, oh, do you like Northeastern? And I'm like, as an institution, no. However, faculty and my community and students I have met have just changed my life and have absolutely been incredible sources of motivation and inspiration for me to understand myself, understand my responsibilities, as well as kind of what I've been subjected to in my life and how they're integrated into bigger systems. So classroom settings have been really important for that. I've had explicitly feminist professors that have not only destigmatized the word feminism, but also provide a space where we can talk about white feminism, and we can talk about complexities of gender, and et cetera, et cetera. So while that has been incredibly transformational, I still have fears of taking feminist classes. I feel when I'm going to choose a class, and if I see that it's a feminist class, I'm like, okay, I'm going to be really vulnerable in this space. We're going to be talking about things that are incredibly important to me as well as sensitive, and I'm really scared I'm going to be triggered. I'm really scared that I'm going to be triggered by students, and the professor isn't going to acknowledge it, the professor isn't going to identify it. The fear also comes because I've had professors that have been really triggering, and I've had feminist professors that have been really trans-exclusive and transphobic. So negotiating that where I can look up to a professor while at the same time feeling hurt and at the same time feeling alienated is really interesting. Also, as a non-binary person, I feel pretty much perpetually ignored or invisible in kind of the narratives around feminism and narratives around being queer. A lot of it exists on the binary, and as someone that has come into their identity as a non-binary person rather recently, it's exhausting to go into classes where I feel like I have to take steps back because the way it's talked about, I have to identify with the portion of being a woman, and I have to identify with those experiences, and it takes me several steps back in my own personal process. So while those spaces can be really healing, it can be really triggering and destabilizing.
Just as a follow-up to that, I think maybe there's also an intergenerational element that we can talk about at this point, because as young feminists who have access to a lot of new terms, a lot of new language, a lot of new identities that maybe, prior like waves or generations of feminists like simply didn't have access to. The way that we speak and the way that we orient our thoughts may be a little bit different, so it can be kind of jarring maybe to enter. I'm not talking about you specifically.
No, I was asking Sarah if it was going to be appropriate when you were done speaking for someone to interject. But
Yes.
please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I thought you were like motioning for yourself. Okay. I just think that the simple things like asking pronouns in a classroom, or when we're talking about feminism, making sure to, if we're talking about women's issues, if the issues are specific to cis women, naming that. If the issues are specific to trans women, naming that. Just like the language can be really important, and a lot of the times I find myself feeling kind of confused when there's a discussion among people who self-identify as feminists. There's still kind of like a disconnect between the language that we use, and I guess kind of it does come down, I think, to an issue of access of where we're getting information and who has, I guess, like who's being represented and who's being excluded.
Okay, great. So I think since you took us there, what we'll do, and I have some more questions for them, but I think since we want this to be sort of more conversational, I have a feeling you have something you want to ask. So
I do.
Let's do it. Let's do it, and like we can roll from there.
Okay. Or not, I don't even know if it's a question so much as I was just really struck by the last two speakers because, and I should say that I teach mostly in English. I'm involved in women's and gender and sexuality studies, but I haven't been in any of those classrooms recently. I have colleagues, as I'm sure you have friends, at other institutions, and I have a colleague who teaches at a women's institution where there seems to be, and I don't think this is particularly the virtue of their administration, I think it has something to do with the demographic, but there does seem to be much more open discussion on campus and much more use of what you were referring to, and I found this really helpful, as the new vocabulary, right? So from my friend who teaches at this women's college, I have come to be familiar with the new vocabulary that is used with, people naming the pronouns they want to have used in the classroom, or naming the differences between issues that affect cis and transgender women, or whatever it might be. This is actually, and this isn't a critique, I just think it's interesting. This is the first time I've been in a room at Northeastern where I've actually heard real life students here using those terms, in ordinary presentation and conversation. And it's also the first time I've heard it, in some ways anywhere, just kind of named really straightforwardly as an intergenerational issue. Like, oh, there are actual, real, different ways of conceiving and talking about the world that have come into being and that need to be incorporated and addressed. And so I guess to the extent that I have, it's really not a question. I guess I just wanted to validate and say that I think it's really useful to name it as something that we need to deal with generationally. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because it brings me back to something I wanted to ask them about. And actually, Kate and I had a conversation after this symposium happened last year, where I told her about this, and she was like, this is a thing that happened on our campus, like none of us have any idea. Were there any students there? And I was like, oh, I don't think there were any students, And so when you said, like, I've never heard, students at our institution talk about, like, which pronoun they want to use, like, not binary things, like, using these things. And there does seem to be, and I'm sure it's not just at this institution, but probably in academia in general, sort of a gap between how faculty with a certain set of radical or queer or feminist politics are making space, and then how students who certainly have a lot less power in some ways, but like more because like they actually care about their money in some ways, are making space. So I wonder if I will come back to you. I was just going to throw it back. Oh, piggybacks. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you all for speaking. I really appreciate it. I wondered if you could speak to this. I sort of felt this personally is sort of how to create a discourse, I think is sort of what you're asking between your individual experience with feminism and sort of the more interdisciplinary aspects of sort of the challenges faced at Northeastern, not just generational, but say bringing this discourse and this conversation to other disciplines outside of the social sciences, something like that, where I think there is a tendency to be even less inviting, and or between student groups as well.
That's exactly what I was going to ask them.
Good job. Anyone else want to take a shot? So that's a really good question, but I first really quickly just want to address what Professor Green was saying. And I also want to take the chance to reiterate, because I know I'm like very scathing of Northeastern as an institution, so I wanted to kind of just reiterate what Daniela said. And a friend of mine summed it up really well recently when she said, "My professors have been incredible. I love the experience I've had with faculty, but I've never once felt supported by the institution unless I was doing something that directly benefited them." So, sort of going off of your comment and question, and also what Sonia was saying about naming it, I think, and this goes both ways, both students to faculty, but also faculty to students, having those conversations. And you know, Dr. Jackson mentioned that we're some of her favorite students. Well, it goes both ways. Like, she is definitively one of my favorite professors here. And one of the things that she does really well, though, is she engages herself with what students are doing. So, you know, I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like she's generally fairly informed about what is going on in the student body. She's aware of the conversations that are happening, which not all professors are, and I think that that's a really important way that we can begin to have this discourse, and not just like gapping or bridging the gap between generations, but also sort of some of these different issues too.
So I guess a little anecdote is Daniela and I both took a statistics class, a statistics in sociology class, and the professor, who I'm sure has very good intentions, began one of our classes by, you know, showing a data graph, and there was binary genders listed there, or sex actually, as he named it. And so we approached him after class and said, you know, this is.
You just have to keep.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So we approached him after class and said, you know, would it be possible to kind of incorporate more nuanced understandings of gender into our classroom if we're talking about data collection, if we're talking about groups of people, specifically in a sociology class, you know, sociology and data collection. I mean, my understanding is the intent is to figure out what issues are being faced by vulnerable groups and vulnerable populations, and maybe looking outside of men and women would be a really good place to start. And he really shot us down and said, you know, well, this is, you know, the statistical formula, the way that it's calculated, this is the way the data has been collected, these are the records that we have, and like this is basically how it is. So it was extremely frustrating and set a very different tone for the rest of my learning experience that semester. Not to say that I'm particularly excited about math to begin with, to be honest, but that just like put a huge damper on it, because I thought, okay, well, if this is how it's going to go, if we're not really being included, if we're not really being heard, I mean, then I don't feel like there's no relevance in it. And it's upsetting because sociology is really an important discipline and has like so much transformational power. Like, we can use these tools to make change, and like if we're getting cut off from the get-go, it makes it really difficult. So
I think Susanna has a question.
And not as a sociologist, believe me. Thank you all for being here so much. I have one point and then a question. One of the things that's not different intergenerationally is dissatisfaction with the institutions in which you are now. And I think one of the things that is striking to me, and this might be a generational difference, is that certainly for my generation of student activists, we never expected it. We never expected the institution to be anything other than at odds whatever institution it might be, whether it's institution of higher learning, whether it's institution of the state, whether it's a prison. I mean, you know, so the expectation that an institution, even this one, would be benevolent, supportive, progressive, you know, advanced theoretic. I mean, I don't know where you get that. So I gotta say, I don't know where that's coming from, because, you know, that's not the nature of institution building in capitalist, patriarchal culture. You know, so that's interesting to me. The question I have, and it's something that sort of animates some of why we decided to have this conference, you know, given how much of student activism now seems to be, for a whole set of interesting reasons, which we can talk about, seems to be focused on the questions, and here I'm going to our topic of pleasure and danger, on danger, and of how to adjudicate danger, how to avoid danger, how to push back against the state's endangerment of us, how to push back against the institutions, lack of protection. Where is there space for young feminist activists to talk about pleasure and to talk about sexual freedom in ways that aren't always wrapped up in freedom from danger, but freedom towards a kind of liberatory notion of sexual desire and the power of that desire? And you know, that was part of the trajectory of some of the earlier discussions of this, and some of what we've been discussing in our group. And I'm interested because there is this flourishing of young feminist activism that I think many of us are thrilled to see and excited by. But also, you know, there is some concern that it's ground on, you know, on the question so strongly on the question of danger. And I wonder if you could speak to that some, any of you.
I guess to me that was sort of surprising to hear, because I haven't found in my experience that there has been as much of an embrace of danger or focus on it, or at least not, like in my classes sometimes people, I feel like, are more willing to speak about feminism and to bring it up in contexts where it isn't explicitly the topic of discussion. And I've found that in contrast, it's actually been more about sexual liberation and like a focus on that, about like perhaps more like power feminism and Beyonce and these positive symbols of feminism. So, but that's interesting.
Regarding space, like where there is this space, in my experience, I have found that space in student groups. Student groups for me have been spaces beyond their mission statement. In my experience, particularly with Progressive Student Alliance and Queer Student Union, while Progressive Student Alliance is textbook, a student group standing in solidarity with labor unions, etc. Queer Student Union is the union, queer students and trans students coming together to create a safe space. Beyond that, and like running campaigns and all of that, it's also a very healing space. For me, it has been incredibly healing in how we have not only these commonalities and anger and frustrations, but also hope and seeking out community and seeking out healing in folks around us. So we've had potlucks, and it's been incredibly empowering for me, because these are all just my peers and myself coming together and being like, we need this space, so let's make it happen. So we have created potlucks, we've created gatherings where we can just be friends and hang out and talk about what we envision and what we want, and while we talk about what we're angry about, we also talk about what we need and what we can provide one another. It's been really beautiful to experience that in terms of mental health a lot, where it's like, while a lot of student groups, I think, expect you to perform and to present and to, like, your value is based on, your value is based on producing, on your power in that group. In my experience, it's been the opposite, where it's like, hey, so y'all know, I'm like really struggling with mental health right now, so I can't really take on this specific task. And folks are like, that's fine, you take care of yourself, and like we'll handle it. And that to me has given me a lot of hope in what is possible, and the fact that we can create right now spaces that are liberatory, and spaces that are centered on what we can create as opposed to what we're fighting against. In terms of pleasure, it's a lot of, in my experience, it's a group. Both of the groups have been spaces where I haven't experienced any slut shaming, which is amazing. And we talk about, whether it's in meetings or in like potlucks or in just gatherings that we have, like to decompress, it's talking about, we talk about things and what we can create, and how it's okay and beautiful to be able to reclaim our bodies and to reclaim our identities and create ourselves for ourselves.
Yeah, so I really agree with what Daniela just said, and also to a few of your earlier points too, about the whole, why would we see the institution as anything other? That could, I mean, you might call it millennial entitlement. I would like to think of it, I would like to think of it more as like idealism, and that goes back to what Daniela was saying about hope, and that's where the pleasure comes in, that we do have this idealism, that we should have things that way. So yeah, I definitely agree with everything Daniela was saying about the mission might appear to be only danger oriented, but where there is pleasure is in these social interactions, in these communities that are created. And also on that point, I would like to say that I think that danger in this context is overly conflated with critique of systems. So I think that, you know, it's seen as dangerous or lacking pleasure to be critiquing systems of, you know, patriarchy, systems of racism, homophobia. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that that's necessary, and I think that's very crucial.
Okay, we have a question from Libby.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to build on Susanna's question and actually pull my thought out of the abstract at the beginning of the program that puts pleasure and danger in a paradoxical relationship, right? The idea is not that they're opposites and you flee one and head for the other, but that you move toward them both at the same time in a certain way. And you know, there's an old article from the New Yorker that's about food. That the idea of, you know, oysters, right? The reason that they're such a desirable food is because you could get really sick from it. Or raw meat, right? The rarer the meat, the better it should be, right? Is the idea. And that you know, when you read the article, you can't help but think that even though sex is not mentioned anywhere, that he's talking, it's Anthony Bourdain or whatever it is, that he's talking about sex, right? And I wonder if it also has if there's also an analogy to be made in the context of learning, right? That the more kind of danger you put yourself in, the more of an intellectual and sort of psychologically transformative learning experience you can have. That actually that not all pleasure is taking place in safe places, but pleasure takes place in dangerous places where you have to give up yourself and take risks and be trusting of people who don't use your vocabulary, right? That even though that might feel risky or endangering in some way, that actually there might be a pretty big payoff there. And I wonder what you think about that as students.
You just gave them a lot. You guys want to take that?
Wow. I guess I can't say anything but that I agree, and I think going back to what Daniela said, it's about having both at once, or that that you have these. It's important, like in student groups, to have those spaces, but also just as part of other events to reach out and branch out. I know that a lot of the stimulation I felt, like the questions that I've pondered the most, that have been the most interesting, have been ones where I didn't necessarily want to go to that event, but sort of just found myself there. And so I guess I'm sort of getting away from your point, but I really think that's an important stance to have?
I think Julie right here has a follow-up.
Yeah, actually, it's actually entirely different. It's more like practical. I actually want to know what you all do, because coming from a history of student activism on public school campuses of student activism, like 60s and 70s, Chicano, like, you know, that movement and BSU movements where a lot of the activism was done across campuses, across student groups. How does that happen in this city when you have so many universities? What are your strategies? Do you engage other students across those campuses? If you do, how? And if that doesn't happen, why don't you think that happens?
I think that's a really great question, and I think that's going to actually leave me with a lot of things to think about after this session, so thank you. In my experience, the inter-college organizing that I've done has been part of the United Students Against Sweatshops network, which also does incorporate a lot of these things that we're talking about today. But I think that one thing that we've been focusing on a lot on Northeastern's campus is coalition building among student groups here on campus. And while I think it's extremely valuable to branch out and develop a network that extends beyond, because all of these issues are taking place across campuses. Like, we know that, and I know that I read the news and I read about actions that are being put together on other campuses and figure out how we can bring that in here. I do think that there's like something lacking, just from my own reflection in terms of building actual relationships and connections. But I do think that we have been doing an amazing job as far as working amongst different student groups that have seemingly different goals and goals and ways to get there. The coalition building that's been happening at Northeastern is pretty powerful. I'm really proud to be a part of that.
I definitely echo a lot of things that Sonia has just said. While there seems to be a general, because Boston is a city of many students, there is generally a lot of intercollegiate organizing that happens. There's a lot in regards to Students for Justice in Palestine, as well as there's been attempts at putting together like Boston USAS, like BUSAS, so it's trying to like create networks between USAS organizations around the city. Honestly, it's really exhausting because it's really important also to maintain a lot of strength and solidity in your own group on campus. And it can become very insular, but it's also, I don't know, there's a lot of pleasure and danger in there, in that like you can find a lot of strength and strengthen your group. You can find a lot of strength and strengthen your groups through communicating with other groups outside of your own Northeastern, outside of like our Northeastern community. But at the same time, it could also lead to weakening your group, in that you might not be able to focus as much attention on like your actual local community and what you're organizing. So that's like this push and pull. And I personally really admire SJP's Boston-wide organizing and the energy that is behind that. It's really, really, really impressive. And they have, I think, monthly meetings where like over 100 students turn out. It's like really incredible. In terms of pleasure and danger coexisting paradoxically, I understand that and I see that 100%. And I see how there is most growth in spaces that are uncomfortable, in putting yourself out there. I've experienced that as an organizer, in having conversations with people that are totally different from me, but trying to find a common ground, and that's really scary, but at the same time, it's really liberating to know that you can connect and find commonalities with people that appear and you would assume are you're so different from. At the same time, being called out is really intense and difficult to process, but at the same time, it's incredibly enriching and for me has been a way that I've been able to grow. So in that danger, I guess I'm understanding danger as something that's scary and something that is kind of throws you off, whether there's actual physical danger there or not. That's kind of how I'm interpreting it. And I can see how the two coexist. And I remember in a presentation after what happened in Ferguson, I think this was last semester, Dr. Jackson mentioned in a presentation about how any change necessitates conflict. And I 100%, that 100% resonates with me, because no change grows in comfortability. And so in there is how pleasure can be found within danger, and how I think pleasure also lies in risking as well, and connecting that to organizing. That's how you're able to create connections and coalitional connections, is through kind of trying to find commonalities within such differences. And energy is usually where I think things fall, because students don't have endless energy, and a lot of times it's like, okay, I can't go to this meeting, and then you feel like you're falling off, and then things start falling, and then coalition isn't built. But then you have homework and assignments, and it's like a really intense negotiation consistently.
Yeah, sorry, I have a few thoughts and things to address, so I'm just trying to take notes. So I guess first, with regards to your question about on-campus organizing and how that actually looks, I also just want to bring up that Northeastern is kind of a unique case study because of our co-op program. Students are always leaving, and that does make it a very difficult environment to even just get people to care about things. Because, you know, if they are only going to be spending, you know, I have some friends who spent a combined total of 2 semesters on campus. So it's really difficult to organize in that setting. I guess more to what Daniela was saying, and I'm really happy that she addressed Professor Adler's question about the coexistence of pleasure and danger. I agree that it's really important, but also I think it's important too to recognize that it's not, I mean, danger is dangerous. It's not always safe to put yourself in situations like that. Physically, literally safe, but also just emotionally safe, and I think that that's something that is really important, especially as university students, because I do not think that university is necessarily an environment that fosters good mental health. And, you know, so one anecdote, we have been organizing on this campus literally since I came here 4 years ago against rape culture, against things that we've seen happening that we disagreed with. And we didn't have the words for it at the time, but there was an initiative called Knockout Barstool, which was basically to remove Northeastern's name from an event hosted by a website that's just horribly misogynist, racist, transphobic, homophobic. And we didn't have the word for it at the time, but my current roommate, who was a lead organizer, was doxxed. You know, so doxing, just
Explain it.
Okay, doxing is basically all of her private information, so where she lived, her phone number, her email was put on the internet for anyone who disagreed with what she was doing, and there was a lot of vitriol. It was kind of one of those cases where, like, the reaction to your action proves the need for the action in the first place. You know, things like her cousin's information, her father's address were being put on the internet. So I think that that's just important to keep in mind when you're talking about the coexistence of pleasure and danger. Yes, it's important to put yourself in dangerous spots so growth can happen, but you have to be very aware of what the risks are and respect what you can do.
Okay, so we're out of time. Thank you all. Please give these awesome students a round of applause.